The receipt was 3 inches wide and 4 inches long, printed on thermal paper the color of old cream, and it had been sitting in an evidence envelope in the Sawyer County Sheriff's Office for 41 years. It was not the most dramatic piece of evidence in the Margaret Ostrowski case file. There was no blood on it. It had not been found at a secondary location or recovered from a suspect's home. It had been photographed, cataloged, and placed in the envelope on the morning of February 19, 1983. When investigators processed the kitchen of a modest ranch house on Birch Lake Road outside Hayward, Wisconsin, and it had sat in that envelope through 5 sheriffs, 2 floods that damaged the lower level of the building, a departmental reorganization, and the complete collapse of the thermal ink into a pale, barely legible shadow of what it had once said. Nobody had asked the right question about it. Not in 1983. Not in the years that followed. Not until a cold case investigator named Lena Charbonneau sat down with the Ostrowski file in the spring of 2022 and noticed something so small that the original detectives could perhaps be forgiven for missing it, and perhaps not. The receipt was out of place. Not in location. In meaning. What that meant, and what it would take to prove, is the story of a secret kept for 4 decades inside a town that had decided, without quite deciding, to let it stay buried. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to the winter of 1983. Because to understand what was taken from Hayward, Wisconsin, you first have to understand what Margaret Ostrowski was. Hayward sits in the lake country of northwestern Wisconsin, where the pines are dense enough to block the horizon, and the winters come in like a wall in November and do not relent until April. In February 1983, the population was just under 2,000, a number that shrank further in winter as the seasonal cabins closed and the snowmobile trails became the primary roads between properties. Ronald Reagan had been in the White House for 2 years. The answering machine had arrived in Hayward. A few of the more modern households had them, blinking red lights on kitchen counters, a technology that still felt vaguely futuristic. The grain co-op on Main Street had a brand new CB radio system for weather alerts. The ice on Nemekagon Lake ran 18 inches thick in February, and on any given weekend morning, the bay behind Pigeon Creek was dotted with the small dark squares of ice fishing houses, smoke rising from their tin stovepipes, the sound of hand-augers carrying a quarter mile in the still cold air. Margaret Ostrowski had been the postmistress of Hayward for 14 years. She was 44 years old, 5 feet 3, with a particular competence and quiet authority that comes from being the person through whom an entire community's news, its bills, its letters, its packages, its government correspondence, passes every single day. She knew who was struggling financially before their neighbors did. She knew who had a son overseas. She knew the return addresses of every catalog subscription, every insurance company, every county court. She held that knowledge the way the job demanded, carefully and to herself. Her husband, Frank Ostrowski, had died of a heart attack in 1979, leaving Peggy with a house on Birch Lake Road and 2 children, a son, Daniel, studying at Milwaukee, and a daughter, Carol, who had married and moved to Wausau the previous year. Peggy managed on her postmistress salary with the same deliberate economy she brought to everything. She kept a budget in a spiral notebook. She maintained the furnace herself, learned from YouTube videos, which did not exist yet. So learned from a neighbor named Arnie Thielen, who came over with a wrench and showed her twice. She kept every receipt she ever received in a square tin box on the kitchen counter. Hardware store, grocery store, the garage in Spooner where she had her tires changed. Every one of them folded once, placed in the tin. It was the kind of detail her daughter Carol would mention years later, the way people mention the specific habits of the people they loved most. She was the most organized person I have ever known in my life. Everything had a place. Everything was accounted for. That was the last description anyone gave of the woman before the morning of February 19th changed everything it touched. At 7:48 on the morning of Saturday, February 19th, 1983, Daniel Ostrowski called his mother from his apartment in Milwaukee. He called every Saturday morning. 7 calls, on average, since he had left for school. His mother had noted this in the spiral notebook. The dates and durations, the way she noted everything. The phone rang 11 times. No answer. He called again at 9:15. No answer. He called his sister Carol in Wausau. Carol called Arnie Thielen, who lived 3 properties east on Birch Lake Road. Arnie drove over at 10:40 and knocked on the front door. The curtains were drawn. Her car was in the carport, which in a Wisconsin February was where it always was at that hour. Arnie tried the door. It was unlocked. He found Peggy Ostrowski in the living room. He called the Sawyer County Sheriff's Department at 10:52. Deputies arrived by 11:15. The scene was processed through the afternoon and into the evening. The cause of death, determined by the Sawyer County medical examiner the following day, was blunt force trauma. The living room showed clear signs of a struggle. A lamp had been overturned, a side table displaced. The front door, which Peggy invariably locked, Carol confirmed this. Her mother checked the lock before bed every night without exception, had been found unlocked by Arnie Thielen. The kitchen was undisturbed. Coffee cup in the drying rack. The spiral notebook opened to the February page, the tin box of receipts on the counter, lid on, contents in order, and beside the tin box, not inside it, 1 receipt. Placed flat on the counter. For a purchase of $47.30 at Birch River Farm Supply, dated February 18, 1983, the day before Peggy died. It was photographed, cataloged, placed in an evidence envelope. It was noted in the original case file that it appeared to be a receipt belonging to the victim, possibly set aside to be filed. No one asked why Peggy Ostrowski, the most organized person her daughter had ever known, had left a receipt outside the tin. The lead investigator assigned to the case was a Sawyer County detective named Walt Crimmins. He was 52 years old, a Korean War veteran's son who had grown up in Hayward, married a woman from Cable, and spent his entire career in the county. He was thorough and careful and had handled homicides before, 3 in his career, all solved within 90 days. The Ostrowski case was different from the first week. There was no shortage of people who had known Peggy. There was a shortage of anyone who could explain what had happened in the hours before Arnie Thielen found her. Crimmins developed 2 persons of interest. The first was a seasonal worker named Terry Mack, who had done odd jobs for several properties along Birch Lake Road the previous autumn, and who had a prior conviction for burglary in Polk County. Crimmins spent 3 weeks on Mack. He had left Hayward in January for a logging job in the Upper Peninsula. 5 people confirmed his presence in Michigan on February 18th and 19th, including a foreman and 2 co-workers who had bunkhouses with sign-in logs. Mack was eliminated. The second person of interest was Peggy's neighbor to the west, a man named Gordon Lear, who had been involved in a property dispute with Frank Ostrowski years earlier, and who had, according to 2 separate neighbors, been seen arguing with Peggy at her mailbox the previous November. Crimmins interviewed Lear twice. He was cooperative, mild, and had spent the evening of February 18th at a fish fry at the Elks Lodge that 30 people attended. He was eliminated. Meanwhile, Carol Ostrowski drove from Wausau to Hayward and stayed in her mother's house for 6 weeks. She went through every piece of paper in the spiral notebook. She called her mother's friends. She sat with Walt Crimmins twice a week, every week, and asked him the same question. "What can I do?" He told her the same thing both times. "Stay close and wait." Carol told him that waiting was not something she was built for. He said he understood. He meant it. The institutional failure that would define this case arrived not through malice, but through assumption. In his review of the physical evidence, Crimmins noted the receipt on the kitchen counter and recorded his conclusion in the case file. Appears to be a recent purchase by victim, left out for filing. That was the end of the receipt's role in the original investigation. It was not traced to its purchase. The name on it, if one existed, was not confirmed. The specific items purchased were not cross-referenced with the contents of Peggy's house or property. Birch River Farm Supply was 9 miles north of Hayward. Peggy Ostrowski did not own a farm. She did not own livestock. She had no documented reason to purchase $47.30 worth of farm supplies. That question was never asked. By 1987, 4 years had passed. The case was officially open and practically frozen. Walt Crimmins had retired in 1986, his last case file transferred to a younger deputy who left the department 18 months later for a position in Eau Claire. The Ostrowski file moved to the cold case shelf, a metal cabinet in a back room that was reorganized and partially damaged in a 1994 flood that soaked the lower storage level and ruined 14 boxes of records from the 1970s. The Ostrowski box survived, elevated on a shelf above the waterline, the evidence envelope intact inside a sealed plastic bag that someone, at some point, had the foresight to add. Carol Ostrowski had moved back to Wausau, but returned to Hayward every February 19th. She would drive the 4 hours in whatever weather February produced, park in front of the house on Birch Lake Road, which she had eventually sold, but which she could not stop visiting, and sit in her car for a while, looking at the carport where her mother's car had been on the morning Arnie Thielen knocked on the door. Then she would go to the cemetery. Then she would drive back to Wausau. She did this for 39 years. Daniel Ostrowski had become an accountant in Milwaukee. He had 2 sons of his own. He had framed the last letter his mother had written him, a short note about the ice fishing conditions, and a request that he bring warmer socks when he visited at Easter, and kept it on the wall of his home office. He called Carol every February 19th. They stayed on the phone for an hour. They talked about their mother. They talked about who she had been. They did not talk much about whether they believed it would ever be solved, because that question had no comfortable answer. The Hayward community had not forgotten Peggy Ostrowski. But communities have a way of absorbing grief into their ordinary life, the way a scar is not a wound anymore, but is also never quite gone. Her name came up when people talked about the town's history. The postmaster who replaced her, and then the one after that, and then the one after that, all knew who had held the job before them. The tin box of receipts sat in Carol's house in Wausau in a dresser drawer. Then, in the spring of 2022, the Wisconsin Department of Justice's Cold Case Unit assigned a new investigator to a backlog of unsolved homicides from the 1980s. Lena Charbonneau was 38 years old, a former Milwaukee PD detective with a particular interest in physical evidence review. She had a way of reading old case files the way an archaeologist reads a dig site, not looking for what was there, but for what was missing, what had been noted and then set aside, what small things had been passed over because the larger picture seemed to demand attention. She opened the Ostrowski file on a Tuesday morning in March. She read it straight through, and when she reached the photograph of the kitchen counter, the tin box with the lid on, and beside it, the single receipt, She stopped. Every case we put on this channel comes from weeks of research, built out of real case records and the stories of the people who refused to let these names disappear. If that matters to you, take a second to like and subscribe, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get back to Peggy. The question Charbonneau asked was the one Walt Crimmins had not. Whose receipt was this? She pulled the original evidence envelope. The receipt had faded severely over 4 decades. Thermal paper loses its ink without the chemical reaction of heat, and 41 years in an evidence bag had taken most of what had been printed there. A date was still legible, 02/18/83. A total, $47.30. The store name at the top, Birch River Farm Supply. The itemized list was gone. The customer copy notation was gone. The register number was a ghost. What was not gone, barely, in the upper right corner, preserved by some accident of the paper fold, was a partial account number. 4 digits from what appeared to be a store account, a credit system that rural farm suppliers commonly used in the early 1980s to let regular customers pay monthly. Charbonneau contacted the current owner of what had once been Birch River Farm Supply. The business had changed hands 3 times. The original building burned in 1997. But the records, remarkably, had been transferred each time in a series of filing boxes that now sat in a storage unit outside Hayward. The current owner, a man named Roy Pesek, told her he had no idea what was in the boxes. He told her she was welcome to look. It took 3 days. Account records from 1983 were paper ledger entries, handwritten, organized by account number. The partial number from the receipt corresponded to an account in the name of a business, Nygaard Agricultural Services. Hayward, Wisconsin, the owner of Nygaard Agricultural Services in February 1983, was a man named Carl Nygaard. He had run a small feed and supply delivery operation out of a barn on Route 77 since 1977. He had delivered to farms, hobby properties, and households across Sawyer County. He had been, by every account that Charbonneau could find in the original case file and in the community memory she began reconstructing through interviews, a familiar and trusted face in the county for 3 decades. He had delivered to properties along Birch Lake Road. His route, reconstructed from his own surviving business records in the same storage unit, included a stop on the road 2 properties west of Peggy Ostrowski's house. Charbonneau looked at the case file again. Carl Nygaard's name did not appear in it. Not in the witness canvas. Not in the persons of interest. Not in the supplemental reports. He had never been interviewed. He had been, in February 1983, a regular enough presence on Birch Lake Road that a receipt with his account number would not, to a neighbor or even a passing deputy, look particularly suspicious sitting on a kitchen counter. It would look like a delivery receipt, left out to be filed. Carl Nygaard was 81 years old when Lena Charbonneau and a Wisconsin DOJ agent named Marcus Webb knocked on the door of his ranch house outside Hayward in September 2022. He had sold the delivery business in 2001 and retired with his wife to the same county he had spent his entire life in. He had attended Peggy Ostrowski's funeral in the spring of 1983. He had been a familiar face at the Feed and Seed Association dinners for 30 years. He coached youth hockey in the 1990s. He was, by the account of nearly everyone who knew him, a good man, a solid citizen, a neighbor you could count on. He answered the door in a flannel shirt. He looked at Lena Charbonneau and at Marcus Webb and at the identification they showed him, and something happened in his face, something small and swift, gone almost before it arrived, that Charbonneau would later describe as the look of a man who had been waiting for a knock that he had almost convinced himself would never come. She asked him about Birch River Farm Supply, About account 4471. About the evening of February 18, 1983, he said nothing for a long moment. Then he asked if he needed an attorney. Charbonneau told him that was his right. He said he understood that. He said, "Let me call my son first." His son arrived within the hour. 20 minutes after that, in the presence of his son and a lawyer reached by phone, Carl Nygard told Lena Charbonneau what had happened in the house on Birch Lake Road in the winter of 1983. He had made a delivery to the property 2 west of Peggy's that afternoon. He had stopped at Peggy's afterward. He admitted, stopped at Peggy's on other occasions, in a way that she had made clear she did not welcome. What happened that evening began as an argument and ended in something he described, in his lawyer's careful language, as a confrontation that got out of hand. He said he had not planned it. He said he had lived with it every day since. He said, "I don't expect that to mean anything to you." Charbonneau told him it didn't. The physical evidence that closed the case came from the same storage unit that had held the account records. A delivery log from February 18, 1983, in Nygard's own handwriting, showing a stop on Birch Lake Road at 4:45 in the afternoon. His account number on the receipt matched the copy in the ledger. Investigators also submitted the original receipt for enhanced imaging, a process using ultraviolet and infrared light to recover faded thermal text that is invisible to the naked eye, which recovered the itemized list. The items purchased on account 4471 that day were feed and salt blocks, not the kind of supplies Peggy Ostrowski had any reason to buy. The receipt had not been left by Peggy to be filed. It had been left by the man who killed her. Carl Nygard was charged with first-degree homicide in October 2022. He entered a guilty plea in February 2023, 40 years and 1 day after the morning Arnie Thielen knocked on the door on Birch Lake Road. He was sentenced to life in prison. He was 82 years old at sentencing. He was led out of the Sawyer County Courthouse in the same February cold that had been there the morning everything changed. The same low-gray sky, the same smell of wood smoke and frozen lake air. Carol Ostrowski attended the sentencing. She was 67 years old. She had made the drive from Wausau in February weather for 39 years before this one. Her brother Daniel sat beside her. When the sentence was read, she did not cry. She had told a reporter the day before that she had decided years ago that she would not let him have that. She sat straight in her seat, and she listened. And when it was over, she walked out into the cold Hayward morning and stood there for a while, just breathing. Margaret Ostrowski was 44 years old. She kept her receipts in a tin box, every one of them, because she was the kind of person who believed that everything should be accounted for, and everything should have a place. She had a spiral notebook with a February page. She called her son every Saturday morning. She knew the return address of every letter that passed through her hands, and she kept other people's business to herself, with the quiet competence of someone who understood that trust is not a small thing. She could not have known that the one receipt left outside the tin would spend 41 years doing the accounting she never got to finish. Carol Ostrowski has said that she intends to donate the tin box to the Sawyer County Historical Society, with a note explaining what it represents. She said, "I want people to know who she was, not just what happened to her, who she was." Daniel Ostrowski, in the interview he gave after the sentencing, said that what he keeps returning to is a simple thing. The fact that his mother's meticulousness, the habit that made her seem almost fussy to people who didn't understand it, was the thing that ultimately mattered. She left a trail without knowing she was leaving it. That was just who she was. she accounted for things. The Wisconsin DOJ Cold Case Unit has since cited the Ostrowski case in their review protocols for physical evidence re-examination, specifically the value of asking contextual questions about evidence placement, not just what an object is, but what it means that it is where it is. It is a small procedural addition. It costs nothing, and somewhere in it is Peggy Ostrowski's way of doing things, passed into the work of the people who finally answered for her. What do you think happens when investigators assume context instead of questioning it? How many other cases might hinge on a detail that's in the file but never pursued? Does a guilty plea at 82, after a lifetime lived freely, constitute justice, or only its final form? And when you think about Carol Ostrowski driving 4 hours every February 19th for 39 years in whatever the winter brought, what does that tell us about what it means to refuse to let someone disappear? Share your thoughts below. These stories belong to all of us who believe that accounting for things matters. Justice came for Margaret Ostrowski after 41 years. Stories like hers remind us that truth, however late, always finds its way to the light. If you believe that too, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More solved cold cases are waiting in the description. Thank you for watching.